in the winter fields of Domremy, where frost settled like prophecy on dormant earth, a peasant girl knelt among the cabbages and heard something that would change the world. The sound pierced through her like starlight cutting darkness, carrying words that would reshape kingdoms and echo through centuries yet unborn. This is the story of how history chose its most unlikely instrument. A 17-year-old who had never held a sword, never read a book, never traveled beyond the hills of her childhood. What she would accomplish defied every law of nature and politics, challenging kings and commanders who had ruled through force alone. In an age when miracles were dismissed as superstition and peasants knew their place, Jeanne d'Arc would prove that extraordinary calling recognizes no earthly boundaries. Her journey from village obscurity to the center of history's stage would test faith against power, innocence against experience, and divine will against human ambition. Before the peasant girl heard the voices that would change the world, the realm bled from a wound that would not heal. For nearly a century, the lilies of France had withered beneath foreign boots, while brothers fought brothers for a crown that seemed cursed by God himself. This was the kingdom's winter, a season of despair so deep that only a miracle could bring the spring. The quarrel began, as all great tragedies do, with a simple question that princes could not answer. Who should rule when the bloodline ends? When the last of the Capetian kings died without sons in the year of our Lord 1328, two men stepped forward to claim the throne that had once belonged to St. Louis. Philip of Valois spoke for the ancient law that said no woman could pass the crown to her children, while Edward of England invoked his descent through the female line, from kings who had ruled before memory began. What followed was not a war, but a wound in the flesh of Christendom itself. The English, those island wolves who had never learned to be satisfied with their own shores, brought their longbows across the narrow sea and taught continental knights that armor was no protection against arrows loosed by common men with steady hands. At Crécy, where the flower of French chivalry charged into ranks of stakes and bodkins, the old world learned that birth mattered less than discipline when death came singing through the morning air. Poitiers confirmed what Crécy had whispered, that the age of mounted glory was ending beneath the methodical slaughter of professional soldiers. King Jean the Good himself fell captive to a mere knight's son, dragged from his horse like any common criminal, while his golden banner trampled in mud red with royal blood. The ransom demanded for his return could have built a dozen cathedrals, yet still the island kingdom held him fast, teaching France that even anointed kings were merely pieces in a game played by men who counted coins more carefully than souls. Through decades of defeat and humiliation, the realm learned to live with wounds that never healed. English garrisons squatted in French castles like ravens in abandoned nests, their banners mocking the very air with foreign symbols. Norman peasants who had spoken the tongue of Charlemagne for 8 centuries found themselves learning Saxon words or starving when the harvest came due. The roads that had once carried pilgrims to the shrines of saints now witnessed only the passage of mercenary companies, unemployed soldiers who served whichever lord could pay their wages and left devastation in their wake like locusts consuming green fields. But the true catastrophe was yet to come. In the year 1415, on the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, Henry V of England led his mud-caked army across the fields of Azincourt and shattered what remained of French military might. 6,000 nobles and knights, the very sinew of the realm's strength, perished in a single afternoon beneath a rain of goose-feathered death. The constable himself died clutching the oriflamme, that sacred banner which had led French armies since the Crusades, its golden flames extinguished forever in the Norman clay. Henry's victory was so complete that even the French began to whisper that perhaps God himself favored the English cause. How else to explain the systematic destruction of every army that bore the lilies, the capture of every fortress that flew the royal standard? When the conqueror rode through the gates of Rouen and proclaimed himself heir to St. Louis, men crossed themselves and wondered if the apocalypse had come at last to the eldest daughter of the church. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in the cathedral where Clovis himself had been baptized, completed the humiliation that warfare had begun. Charles the Mad, sixth of that name among French kings, acknowledged his own son as a bastard and declared the English monarch heir to thrones that had been French since Roman eagles last flew over the Rhine. The document, sealed with wax and witnessed by bishops, made legal what conquest had already accomplished: the extinction of an independent France after 8 centuries of glory. Still, the ink was barely dry upon the parchment when God intervened in his mysterious way. Henry the Conqueror, that terror of French knights and scourge of walled cities, fell sick of a fever that no physician could cure and died raving in his tent before he could enjoy the crown he had purchased with so much blood. Across the narrow sea, the mad king, whom he had displaced, followed him into the grave within months, leaving behind only children and widows to inherit a realm divided between 2 infant claimants. The English proclaimed little Henry VI as king of both England and France, though the boy could barely walk, let alone wield the sword of kingship. His uncles, those iron-willed princes who had learned statecraft in the harsh school of foreign conquest, ruled in his name from behind the walls of English-held fortresses. Their administration was efficient and ruthless, demanding taxes from peasants who had never seen benefit from foreign rule, and hanging rebels with the methodical precision of men who understood that terror could accomplish what affection never would. South of the Loire, in the ancient city of Bourges, where the cathedral rose like a prayer-made stone, another court maintained the fiction that France still possessed a rightful sovereign. Charles VII, called the Dauphin by his supporters and Pretender by his enemies, held court in rooms that had once witnessed the splendor of his ancestors. But this was a pale shadow of royal majesty, a landless king surrounded by impoverished nobles who pledged loyalty they could not afford and service they could not provide. The young prince cut a sorry figure among the ruins of his inheritance, where his forebears had commanded armies that could shake the earth with their passage. He struggled to maintain a household guard of a few hundred men-at-arms, where the kings of old had dispensed justice from thrones of ivory and gold. He heard petitions from a chair that had seen better centuries. His very legitimacy remained in question. The Treaty of Troyes had declared him bastard-born, and there were whispers, even among his own supporters, that perhaps his mother's confession contained more truth than poetry. Surrounding the exiled court, the nobility of southern France maintained their ancient privileges, while their world crumbled around them. These were men who could trace their lineages back to the companions of Roland, whose ancestors had followed Godefroy to Jerusalem and St. Louis to the Holy Land. Yet now they squabbled over precedence in a kingdom that existed more in memory than reality, their castles mortgaged to Italian bankers and their retainers scattered to seek employment with whoever could afford to pay wages. The common folk, those who worked the black earth and tended the vineyards, suffered most grievously of all. English taxation fell upon them like hail upon ripening grain, while French levies stripped away what little the foreigners had left behind. Mercenary companies, masterless men who had learned no trade but war, descended upon villages like wolves upon sheep, taking what they pleased and burning what they could not carry. The great pestilence, the Black Death, which had already scoured half of Christendom, returned again and again to harvest souls from settlements weakened by constant warfare. In Normandy and the Ile-de-France, English administrators worked to transform conquest into governance. These were capable men, trained in the universities and tested in the counting houses, who understood that profitable rule required more than mere force of arms. They repaired roads, established markets, and enforced a harsh but predictable justice that protected merchants willing to accept foreign sovereignty. Under their rule, trade began to flow again, along rivers that had been closed to commerce for decades. Beneath this veneer of efficient administration, resistance simmered like coals beneath ashes. French knights who had bent the knee in public plotted rebellion in private, while common folk who had accepted English rule for want of alternatives whispered prayers for deliverance in the shadows of churches built by their ancestors. The occupiers could command obedience through fear, but they could not purchase the love that transforms subjects into citizens or conquerors into legitimate rulers. Religious authority itself seemed fractured beyond repair. The Great Schism, that scandal which had given Christendom two rival popes for nearly 40 years, had ended only recently, leaving behind wounds that had not yet healed. French bishops who had supported the Avignon claimant found themselves suspect in the eyes of their English masters, while English ecclesiastics struggled to win acceptance from congregations who prayed for their departure each Sunday. The University of Paris, once the jewel of European learning, had become a tool of English policy, its masters more concerned with justifying foreign rule than seeking divine truth. Burgundy complicated the picture further, that ambitious duchy which had grown rich on Flemish wool and Italian gold. Duke Philip the Good, called so for his largesse rather than his virtue, commanded territories that stretched from the North Sea to the gates of Lyon. His alliance with the English had made possible their victories, yet it was in partnership born of convenience rather than conviction. The Burgundians fought not from love of England, but from hatred of France, their memories poisoned by the murder of Philip's father on the bridge at Montereau. This three-way division of loyalties, English, French, and Burgundian, had paralyzed the realm like a body whose limbs refused to obey a single mind. Armies marched and countermarched across countryside that could ill afford such traffic, while diplomats spun webs of alliance and betrayal that ensnared prince and peasant alike. Men who had once fought under the same banners now faced each other across siege lines, their oaths of loyalty transformed into instruments of mutual destruction. In the autumn of 1428, the English launched the Siege of Orléans, convinced it was the right moment to wrap up their campaign in the Loire Valley. The city stood like a key in the lock of southern France. If it fell, the road to Bourges would lie open, and with it the final destruction of Dauphin resistance. For months, English engineers had laboured to surround the ancient walls with a ring of fortifications, each redoubt positioned to command the approaches and prevent relief forces from breaking through. Within the city, citizens who had never known foreign rule prepared to resist unto death, rather than surrender the lilies for the leopards of England. They had food enough to last the winter and walls that had stood since the days of the Romans, but they lacked the one thing that victories required: hope that their sacrifice might serve some greater purpose. Day by day, the English ring grew tighter, while messengers sent to the Dauphin returned with empty promises and excuses that convinced no one. The realm held its breath as winter deepened into the new year of 1429. Orléans, the city of kings, seemed doomed to fall as every other stronghold had fallen, its defenders destined to join the countless thousands who had already perished for the lost cause of French independence. The English prepared their final assault with the methodical precision that had served them well at Harfleur-en-Caen, confident that spring would see them masters of the Loire, as they were already masters of the Seine. In village churches throughout the divided realm, priests offered prayers for deliverance that seemed to echo unanswered in the winter sky. The old prophecies spoke of a virgin who would restore the kingdom, but these were tales fit for minstrels rather than practical men who knew the weight of English gold and the sharpness of English steel. France lay broken beneath the wheel of foreign ambition, her ancient glory reduced to memory, and her future mortgaged to enemies who would grind her bones to make their bread. Yet in a village so small that maps barely marked its name, in a house where goats sheltered beside the hearth, and angels walked unrecognized among the shadows, a peasant girl was beginning to hear voices that would soon teach the world that God's arithmetic differed from that of earthly accountants. The kingdom's winter was nearly over, though none yet guessed that spring would come through a child who had never learned that miracles were impossible. As France crumbled, it wasn't a prince or a knight who heard the call to save it. It was a teenage girl who had never seen battle. In the village of Domremy, where the morning mist rose from the Meuse like incense from a hidden altar, 13-year-old Jeanne d'Arc knelt among the cabbages her father had planted and listened to a voice that spoke with the authority of heaven itself. The sound came not through her ears, but through some deeper sense that had no name in earthly language, carrying words that would echo through the centuries, long after the stones of her village had crumbled into dust. The voice belonged to Michael the Archangel, that warrior of God who had cast down Lucifer and stood guard at the gates of paradise. His presence filled the garden with light that had no source, warmth that touched no earthly fire, and a certainty that pierced through the confusion of mortal understanding like a sword through silk. Jeanne, he spoke, and in that single word lay contained the destiny of kingdoms and the fate of an anointed king who knew not that salvation approached on bare feet through fields of grain. Behind the great archangel came others, whose names the child recognized from prayers mumbled in the village church. Catherine of Alexandria, that learned virgin who had disputed with pagan philosophers and died beneath the wheel for her faith, and Margaret of Antioch, who had emerged from the belly of a dragon with the cross of Christ blazing in her hand. These were not the pale figures of painted glass that adorned the windows of Domremy's modest chapel, but beings of such radiance that the very air seemed to sing when they drew near. Simple in words, the message reached even the humblest ear, yet what it asked was beyond human reach. The English siege of Orléans must be lifted. The Dauphin must be crowned at Reims as his ancestors had been for 7 centuries, and the realm must be cleansed of foreign occupation. All this would be accomplished not through the might of armies or the wisdom of counselors, but through a maid who had never wielded weapon nor read letter, who knew nothing of warfare save the stories her grandfather told of battles fought before her birth. At first, the child said nothing to her family of these visitations. Jacques d'Arc was a solid man who trusted in his plough more than in prophecy, while Isabelle Romay possessed the practical wisdom of women who had buried children and knew that miracles were scarce as gold in the purses of the poor. To speak of angels in a house where bread was earned through honest labour would invite questions that had no comfortable answers, mockery that would sting worse than winter wind. For 3 years, the voices came to her in field and forest, in the shadowed corners of the village church, where she prayed longer than any girl her age should need to pray. The celestial messengers grew more insistent with each visitation, their commands more specific, their prophecies more urgent. The realm was bleeding to death while she hesitated. The rightful king grew grey with despair while she tended her father's flocks, and Orléans withered beneath English axes while she spun wool by her mother's fire. Michael showed her visions of the siege that made her weep, citizens who rationed their last grains of wheat while English engineers dug trenches ever closer to the walls, children who cried for mothers who would never return, soldiers who stood watch on battlements where hope had long since died. The archangel's voice carried the weight of divine displeasure when he reminded her that God's work suffered delay, while his chosen servant concerned herself with earthly matters, fit only for those who had never heard the call to greatness. Catherine taught her that learning was not confined to those who read books, that wisdom flowed directly from heaven to hearts prepared to receive it. The saint spoke of warfare and statecraft as if they were prayers to be memorized, revealing secrets of command and strategy that no village girl should have possessed. Under her tutelage, the child learned to think like a general while remaining innocent as a dove, to plan campaigns while preserving the purity that made her fit for divine service. Margaret whispered of martyrdom, preparing her pupil for sufferings that might surpass even those of the ancient saints. The dragon slayer spoke of fire and pain, of enemies who would test faith with more cruelty than any pagan emperor had ever devised. Through these dark prophecies, the maid learned that victory would demand sacrifices greater than any she could yet imagine, that the crown she was destined to place upon the Dauphin's head might cost her own life in the purchasing. The first person to notice the change in Jacques d'Arc's daughter was Durand Laxart, her uncle by marriage, a man whose practical nature had not entirely extinguished his capacity for wonder. When the girl appeared at his door in the spring of her 17th year, speaking with authority that sat strangely upon her peasant features, he recognized something that transcended mere family affection or village loyalty. "Uncle," she said, employing the courtesy title that peasants used for elder kinsmen, "the time has come for you to conduct me to Robert de Baudricourt at Vaucouleurs. The realm has need of me, and I dare not delay longer when celestial voices command my departure." Her words carried conviction that brooked no argument, certainty that transformed a request into something approaching a royal command. The journey to Vaucouleurs took them through countryside that bore witness to a century of warfare. Burned villages marked the passage of mercenary companies, while abandoned fields grew wild with weeds that choked the grain their former owners would never harvest. English patrols controlled the main roads, forcing travelers to skulk through forests where brigands preyed upon those whom war had not already destroyed. At the fortress of Vaucouleurs, where the lilies of the realm still flew above walls that had never known foreign occupation, Robert de Baudricourt commanded a garrison that existed more through stubbornness than strength. This was a man who had held his post through 2 decades of defeat, who had watched stronger fortresses fall while maintaining his own through a combination of careful diplomacy and judicious violence. When the peasant girl requested audience, claiming divine mission to save the realm, Baudricourt's first impulse was to have her whipped back to her village like any other madwoman who troubled his peace. The roads were full of prophets and visionaries, most of them harmless lunatics whose fantasies posed no threat to anyone save themselves. A few were English spies who used religious mania to mask their true purposes, and these required hanging rather than dismissal. But something in the maid's bearing gave him pause, a quality of assurance that suggested either genuine inspiration or madness so complete that it had achieved its own form of sanity. She spoke of matters that no village girl should have understood: the dispositions of English forces around Orléans, the mood of the Dauphin's court at Chinon, the secret fears that kept commanders awake in the dark hours before dawn. "My lord," she said, fixing him with eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond her years. "I am come to inform you that my lord commands that the Dauphin be made king, and that I shall lead him to his coronation." "Who is your lord?" Baudricourt asked, testing her with the skepticism of a man who had heard every manner of falsehood. "The King of Heaven," she replied without hesitation, and in those 3 words lay contained a faith that could move mountains or break itself upon stones, depending upon the will of Providence. For weeks the captain hesitated, dispatching subtle questions to uncover the origins of the remarkable daughter before him. The reports that returned spoke of honest folk who paid their taxes and attended mass, who had given no sign of heresy or madness until their youngest child began claiming commerce with angels. Jacques d'Arc himself had been heard to swear that he would drown his daughter with his own hands, rather than see her consort with soldiers. Yet the girl's conviction had somehow worn down even his determined opposition. During this time of waiting, the maid lodged with Henri and Catherine Leroyer, devout persons who provided shelter for travelers bound on legitimate business. Under their roof, she displayed virtues that impressed even those predisposed to doubt her claims. She prayed with such fervor that hardened men-at-arms crossed themselves when they heard her voice raised in petition to the Almighty. She fasted so severely that her hosts feared for her health, consuming only bread and water on days when others feasted on meat and wine. More remarkable still was her knowledge of events transpiring far beyond the reach of normal intelligence. She spoke of an English defeat at Rouvray-Saint-Denis before any messenger could have brought word to Vaucouleurs, describing the action with precision that suggested either divine revelation or extraordinary espionage. When confirmation arrived days later, Baudricourt began to reconsider his assumption that the girl was merely another deluded peasant. The final test came when she predicted the outcome of a battle being fought near Orléans, providing details so specific that the captain decided to risk his reputation upon her claims. If she proved false, he could always claim that he had been investigating suspected English spies. If she proved true, he might find himself remembered as the man who had recognized divine intervention when it appeared in his anteroom, wearing homespun wool and speaking with a voice that carried authority beyond her station. Word came of her accuracy just as winter gave way to spring, confirming prophecies that no earthly intelligence could have provided. Baudricourt summoned her to his hall and spoke the words that would change the course of history. "Go then, and let come what may." The captain provided her with male clothing for protection during the journey, a horse to carry her over roads infested with brigands, and a small escort of men-at-arms who accepted their mission with the resignation of soldiers who had learned to obey orders regardless of their personal opinions. The transformation from peasant girl to warrior maid began with the donning of male attire, that practical necessity that would later provide her enemies with charges of impropriety and divine displeasure. The doublet and hose felt strange upon limbs accustomed to skirts, while the sword at her hip seemed to carry weight beyond its steel. These were more than mere garments. They were the visible signs of a metamorphosis that touched her soul as well as her appearance. Reaching Chinon meant 11 days through a landscape claimed by both English patrols and roaming bandits, neither of whom answered to any law but force. The maid's party travelled mostly by night, following paths known to smugglers and rebels, avoiding main roads where foreign soldiers might question travellers who could not account for their business. Through forest and field they rode, guided by men who had learned to read the landscape like a book written in shadow and starlight. At river crossings, swollen with spring floods, they waited for boats whose masters demanded gold they did not possess, convincing ferrymen through appeals to patriotism that rang hollow in the mouths of men who had learned to serve whoever could pay their wages. In village inns, where strangers were viewed with suspicion, they claimed to be merchants bound for southern markets, displaying goods that would not bear close inspection, while praying that their deception would not be discovered. The maid endured these hardships with patience that amazed her escorts, never complaining of cold or hunger, never questioning the wisdom of routes that seemed to lead away from their destination rather than toward it. She attended Mass wherever churches could be found, kneeling in prayer with such concentration that her companions began to whisper among themselves that perhaps the girl's claims contained more truth than they had initially supposed. As they drew nearer to Chinon, the signs of war grew more pronounced. Refugees crowded the roads leading south, their possessions loaded onto carts that groaned beneath the weight of lives torn from their foundations. These were the displaced persons of a realm at war with itself, farmers whose fields had been trampled by armies, merchants whose shops had been looted by passing soldiers, artisans whose skills found no market in times when men valued weapons more than works of beauty. Among these wretched crowds, the maid heard stories that confirmed what her voices had told her of the realm's desperate condition. Orléans grew weaker with each passing day, its defenders reduced to eating rats and boiled leather, while English engineers dug their trenches ever closer to the walls. The Dauphin remained at Chinon, paralyzed by indecision and surrounded by councillors who offered advice as contradictory as it was worthless. The castle of Chinon rose from its hillside like a prayer-made stone, its towers reaching toward heaven in testimony to the faith of builders who had believed that earthly kingdoms could aspire to divine approval. Within its walls, the court of the uncrowned king maintained the ceremonies of majesty while lacking the substance of royal power. Here gathered the remnants of the nobility who had not submitted to English rule, men whose titles carried more weight than their purses, and whose loyalty exceeded their ability to provide practical assistance. The Dauphin himself received petitioners in a hall hung with tapestries that depicted victories won by ancestors whose graves had long since been forgotten. This was a man aged beyond his years by responsibility he had never sought, burdened with a crown he could not claim and a realm he could not govern. His courtiers whispered that the Treaty of Troy had been correct in declaring him bastard-born, that perhaps legitimacy had died with his father's reason and could not be resurrected through mere desire. Into this atmosphere of defeat and despair came a peasant girl who claimed that heaven itself had sent her to restore the kingdom and crown its rightful sovereign. The very audacity of her mission should have provoked laughter, but something in her bearing commanded attention from men who had grown weary of conventional wisdom that offered nothing but continued failure. When she requested audience with the Dauphin, claiming divine authorization for her embassy, even the most skeptical courtiers found themselves curious to hear what message she might bear. The test that followed would be remembered long after the names of princes had been forgotten. In a hall filled with nobles dressed in their finest garments, the Dauphin attempted to deceive his visitor by hiding among his courtiers, while another man wore the royal circlet and sat upon the throne. But the maid's eyes went straight to the true prince, ignoring the impostor entirely as she knelt before him and spoke words that only heaven could have provided. "Most noble Dauphin," she said, employing the title that acknowledged his royal blood while recognizing his uncrowned state, "I am come to tell you, on behalf of the King of Heaven, that you shall be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and that you shall be lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is King of all the realm." The precision of her recognition, the authority of her address, and the substance of her promise struck the court like lightning illuminating a midnight sky. What followed was private conference between the maid and the prince, conversation that none save they would ever know in its fullness. Chroniclers would later speculate about secrets revealed, prophecies delivered, and signs given that convinced the Dauphin of her divine mission. Whatever words passed between them in that shadowed chamber, the result was transformation. A broken man emerged renewed, a doubting prince became a believing king, and a court paralyzed by despair suddenly found itself preparing for war. The ecclesiastical examination that followed was mere formality, though conducted with the thoroughness that churchmen brought to all matters touching divine revelation. Theologians from the University of Poitiers questioned the maid for weeks, testing her orthodoxy and examining her claims with the skepticism of men who knew that the devil could quote scripture to serve his purposes. They found no heresy in her words, no falsehood in her mission, no stain upon the purity that marked her as fit for divine service. More intimate was the examination conducted by the Queen's ladies, who verified the maid's virginity with the thoroughness that royal bloodlines demanded of those who claimed supernatural mission. This physical confirmation of her spiritual state satisfied the requirements of prophecy while protecting the court from accusations that they had been deceived by common imposture. Armed with these attestations of orthodoxy and purity, the Dauphin ordered that his unlikely champion be equipped for the war that her voices had commanded her to wage. Armorers worked through days and nights to create protection fit for divine service, while weaponsmiths forged blades that would carry the authority of heaven into earthly combat. Most significant was the banner she requested, white silk emblazoned with the image of Christ in majesty, attended by angels whose wings spread wide enough to shelter an army. As spring ripened towards summer and the siege of Orléans entered its most desperate phase, the court of the uncrowned king prepared to gamble everything upon the word of a peasant girl who claimed friendship with archangels. The maid herself felt no doubt, for her voices had grown silent now that their earthly mission approached fulfillment. The time for visions had passed. The hour for action had arrived. The relief army that gathered at Blois in the spring of 1429 bore little resemblance to the magnificent hosts that had once followed the Oriflamme to glory and defeat. 4,000 men answered the Dauphin's call, a mixture of knights whose armor bore the dents of a dozen defeats, men-at-arms who fought for silver rather than honor, and common soldiers whose loyalty extended no further than their next meal. What transformed this collection of mercenaries and malcontents into an instrument of divine purpose was the presence of a 17-year-old peasant girl who rode among them as if leading the armies of heaven itself. She appeared before the assembled troops wearing white armor that gleamed like captured starlight, her banner snapping in the morning breeze with images that seemed to move in the shifting light. The device showed Christ in majesty surrounded by angels whose wings spread wide enough to shelter kingdoms, while golden fleur-de-lis scattered across the silk like fallen stars. When she spoke to the soldiers in her clear voice that carried to the farthest ranks, hardened fighters who had learned to mock all authority found themselves crossing themselves and murmuring prayers they had forgotten since childhood. My brothers, she called them, using the term that made nobles and commoners equal before God. We go to lift the siege of Orléans and drive English from the realm that rightfully belongs to our sovereign lord. I am sent by the King of Heaven to accomplish this work, and I promise you that before the moon changes, we shall see the lilies flying where the leopards fly today. Her words carried conviction that infected even the most cynical veterans, transforming doubt into determination and fear into righteous fury. The march to Orléans took the army along the south bank of the Loire, following roads that had witnessed the passage of countless armies over 8 centuries of warfare. But this procession differed from all that had come before. Priests preceded the soldiers, chanting hymns that rose toward heaven like incense from a divine altar, while the maid herself insisted that every man confess his sins and receive the sacraments before entering combat. She declared that God would not grant victory to those who carried mortal sin upon their souls, and her authority was such that even the most dissolute soldiers sought absolution from chaplains who had grown accustomed to blessing men who cared little for their eternal destination. At the fortress of Les Tourelles, the massive stone tower that commanded the southern approach to Orléans, English engineers had laboured for months to create defences that could withstand any conceivable assault. The position bristled with cannon, whose bronze mouths could hurl stone balls capable of shattering castle walls, while crossbowmen and longbow archers commanded every approach with missiles that could pierce the finest armour. Connecting this stronghold to the smaller English positions around the city was a network of trenches and palisades that had taken the lives of hundreds of workers, but had created a ring of steel that no conventional force could hope to break. Inside Orléans itself, citizens who had endured 6 months of siege faced their darkest hour with the stoicism of people who had learned that miracles were scarce as bread in their beleaguered markets. Jean de Dunois, the bastard brother of the assassinated Duke of Orléans, commanded the defense with the skill of a professional soldier and the desperation of a man who knew that failure meant not merely military defeat, but the extinction of everything he held sacred. His garrison had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 effective fighters, while the population survived on rations that grew smaller with each passing day. The maid's arrival changed everything in ways that no chronicler could adequately describe. As her white banner appeared on the far shore of the Loire, bells began ringing throughout the city, not the measured tolling that marked the passage of hours, but the wild celebration that announced deliverance from a seemingly hopeless situation. Citizens who had grown hollow-cheeked from hunger and grey-haired from fear suddenly found themselves laughing and weeping simultaneously, while soldiers who had held their posts through sheer stubbornness discovered reserves of strength they had forgotten they possessed. Battle was joined first at Saint-Lô, a lesser English position standing watch over the city's eastern side. The maid led the assault herself, riding at the front of her troops with a confidence that seemed to transform conventional tactics into something approaching divine intervention. Where previous attacks had broken against the fortress walls like waves upon stone, her assault succeeded through a combination of overwhelming determination and what witnesses could only describe as supernatural protection. Arrows that should have found their mark seemed to bend away from the white-armored figure who advanced with measured steps toward the English palisades. Cannonballs that could shatter oak beams passed harmlessly overhead, while crossbow bolts aimed with deadly precision struck the ground at her feet without touching her person. The defenders, veteran soldiers who had stormed dozens of similar positions, found their hands trembling and their aim unsteady as they faced an enemy who seemed protected by forces beyond mortal understanding. The assault succeeded in a matter of hours, where similar attacks had failed for months. English survivors who managed to escape to other positions carried with them tales of a white demon who led her troops through fire without suffering so much as a singed hair, who spoke of victory with the certainty of a prophet and fought with the skill of a seasoned commander despite her obvious youth and innocence. These stories, spreading through the English camps like plague through a crowded city, began to erode the confidence that had made their army seemingly invincible. Saint-Jean-le-Blanc fell next, its garrison abandoning their positions without offering serious resistance when they saw the white banner approaching through the morning mist. The English commanders, men who had learned their trade in the harsh school of continental warfare, found themselves facing a new kind of enemy, one whose mere presence seemed to drain the fighting spirit from their subordinates, while inspiring their opponents to feats of courage that bordered on the impossible. As darkness faded on the 7th day of May, the attack on Les Tourelles began, driven by fighters who had prayed through the night in place of sleep. The maid herself led the initial charge, carrying a scaling ladder that seemed to grow lighter in her hands with each step toward the fortress walls. Behind her came knights and common soldiers, moving with the unity of purpose that no amount of training could instill, their battle cries echoing across the Loire like the voices of angels calling the faithful to judgment. The English defense was everything that military science could make it. Coordinated volleys of arrows that darkened the sky, cannon fire that shook the earth with its thunder, and sword work that had been perfected through years of victorious campaigning. But human skill proved insufficient against what witnesses described as divine intervention, made manifest in earthly combat. The white-armored figure seemed to multiply herself, appearing simultaneously at different points along the wall, her voice rising above the din of battle to encourage her followers and strike terror into the hearts of her enemies. At midday, when the sun stood highest in a sky clear as crystal, an English arrow found its mark between the plates of the maid's armor, piercing her shoulder with a wound that should have ended her participation in the battle. Those who saw her fall felt their hearts sink like stones thrown into deep water, for it seemed that mortality had finally claimed the one they had begun to believe was beyond the reach of earthly weapons. But the pause in combat lasted only long enough for her to pray, removing the arrow with her own hands while speaking words of thanksgiving rather than complaint. "The King of Heaven does not abandon his servants," she declared, stanching the blood with strips torn from her own banner, while her followers watched in amazement. "This wound is but proof that I am mortal like yourselves, and like you, I serve a cause greater than my own life." The final assault began in the late afternoon, when shadows stretched long across ground already soaked with the blood of 2 armies. The maid, her white armor now stained with crimson, but her determination undiminished, led her troops up ladders that the English could not seem to defend effectively. Where conventional tactics had failed for months, divine inspiration succeeded in a matter of hours, breaking through defenses that had been considered impregnable. Les Tourelles fell as the sun touched the western horizon, its English garrison fleeing across the Loire in boats that could not carry them fast enough from the scene of their defeat. For the first time in decades, the lilies of the realm flew over positions that had been held by foreign soldiers, while church bells throughout Orléans announced that the siege had been broken and the city delivered from destruction. The victory was complete beyond the dreams of those who had prayed for deliverance through the long months of investment. Not only had the immediate threat been lifted, but the psychological impact of success after so many failures transformed the entire character of the war. English soldiers who had considered themselves invincible now looked over their shoulders when the white banner appeared on distant hills, while defenders who had grown accustomed to defeat suddenly believed that victory was possible. Word of the triumph spread faster than horses could carry it, borne by merchants and pilgrims whose tales grew more miraculous with each telling. In taverns and marketplaces, village churches and noble halls, people spoke of the maid who had accomplished in a week what the greatest captains of the realm had failed to achieve in a generation. Some called her saint, others sorceress, but none could deny that her intervention had changed the course of history in ways that would echo through the ages. For 3 days and nights, Orléans shed its fear as celebrations swept through the city, turning once threatened streets into places of dancing and joy. Wine that had been hoarded for the darkest hour flowed like water, while food that had been rationed with miser's care appeared on tables groaning beneath the weight of recovered abundance. Through all this revelry, the maid herself remained apart, praying in the cathedral where she gave thanks for victory, while preparing for the campaigns that her voices had commanded her to undertake. Like wind-blown sand, the balance of power had reshaped itself almost overnight. English positions that had seemed permanent fixtures of the landscape suddenly appeared vulnerable to forces that fought with divine inspiration. Commanders who had grown comfortable in their conquest found themselves forced to reconsider dispositions that had remained unchanged for years, while garrisons that had felt secure behind stone walls began to eye the horizons nervously for signs of approaching white banners. The maid herself felt no inclination to rest upon her achievements, for her celestial advisors had made clear that Orléans was merely the first step in a campaign that would not end until the Dauphin wore the crown that rightfully belonged to him. "We must not delay," she told her captains, men who had won more experience in a single week than many soldiers gained in entire careers. "The English are shaken, but not broken, and if we give them time to recover their courage, we shall find them more difficult to defeat." Less than a week after the triumph at Orléans, the march to Jargeau began, this time with an army unrecognizable from the weary ranks once assembled at Blois. Word of success had drawn volunteers from across the realm, knights who had thought their fighting days were over, men-at-arms who had abandoned hope of meaningful service, and common soldiers who believed that God himself had entered the war on the side of righteousness. The force that followed the white banner numbered nearly 8,000 men, all of them convinced that they served a cause that could not fail. Suffolk himself commanded the English garrison at Jargeau, a nobleman whose military reputation had been earned through victories that had once seemed to prove English superiority beyond question. His position was strong, stone walls that had withstood previous attacks, cannon that could sweep the approaches clear of enemies, and a garrison of veterans who had learned their trade in the conquest of Normandy. Against conventional forces, such defences would have required months of siege work and cost thousands of lives to overcome. But the maid brought something that conventional military science could not account for: the absolute certainty that victory was divinely ordained and therefore inevitable. Her assault began with prayers rather than cannon fire, with hymns rather than battle cries, with the calm assurance that God would provide the means to accomplish his purposes. When the attack came, it succeeded with a swiftness that amazed even her own supporters, breaking through defences that should have held for months. Suffolk himself fell prisoner, a Duke of England reduced to pleading for ransom terms from a peasant girl who spoke of his fate with the detached compassion of a judge pronouncing sentence upon a criminal. The psychological impact of his capture exceeded even the military value of the victory, for it demonstrated that no English position was so strong, no commander so skilled that they could stand against forces fighting under the white banner of divine authority. Mont-sur-Loire surrendered without siege when its garrison learned that the Maid approached with her victorious army. The English withdrawal was so precipitous that they abandoned supplies and artillery that would have taken months to replace, fleeing toward positions that might offer better protection against an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural advantages. Each retreat strengthened the impression that English dominion was crumbling like walls built upon sand, while each victory confirmed that heaven had indeed chosen sides in the struggle for the realm. At Beaugency, the pattern repeated itself with variations that spoke to the growing demoralization of English forces throughout the Loire Valley. The garrison made no serious attempt to defend walls that had protected the crossing for 3 centuries. instead negotiating terms that allowed them to march away with arms and baggage, rather than face the White Terror that had broken every position it had attacked. The speed of their departure suggested that English commanders had concluded that discretion was preferable to the destruction that seemed to follow resistance. The culmination came at Patay, where the flower of English military might made its last stand under the command of Talbot himself, that iron-handed general who had never known defeat in a career spanning 4 decades of successful warfare. The battle that followed lasted less than an hour, ending in a rout so complete that chroniclers struggled to find adequate terms to describe the magnitude of English defeat. 2,000 English soldiers perished in the meadows around Patay, while barely 20 men of the Royal Army suffered mortal wounds. Talbot himself fell captive, along with dozens of knights whose names had once struck terror into defenders throughout the realm. The psychological impact was even greater than the material losses. English survivors carried word throughout their remaining positions that the old advantages of discipline and equipment meant nothing against forces that fought with heaven's blessing. The road to Reims lay open before the victorious army, like a pathway illuminated by divine light. English garrisons that had held their positions for a generation began evacuating at the first news of the approaching White Banner, while nobles who had sworn allegiance to the child King of England quietly sent emissaries to negotiate terms with the Dauphin's representatives. The momentum of victory had created its own reality, transforming what had seemed impossible into what now appeared inevitable. On the 17th day of July, in the year of our Lord 1429, Charles VII entered the Cathedral of Reims, where his ancestors had been crowned for 7 centuries past. The ceremony that followed restored not merely a king to his throne, but legitimacy to a realm that had languished under the shadow of foreign occupation. When the holy oil touched the royal forehead and the ancient crown settled upon the Dauphin's head, the Treaty of Troyes became a meaningless scrap of parchment, for no earthly document could contradict what heaven had ordained. Through all the solemnity of the coronation, the maid stood beside the altar, holding her banner high, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the fulfillment of the prophecy that had called her from her father's fields. "Gentle king," she whispered, as the archbishop pronounced the ritual words that transform prince into sovereign. "Now is accomplished the will of God, who desired that you should come to Reims to receive your worthy consecration, showing that you are the true king and the one to whom the kingdom belongs." Her divine mission was complete, but her earthly trials were only beginning. The voices that had guided her to this moment of triumph grew silent, leaving her to face the complexities of human politics without the celestial counsel that had made her victories possible. She had crowned a king, but kings were made of politics, and Joan was not. No one could explain her, but all could follow her. And behind her banner, France began to rise. Reims changed everything. What had started as a peasant girl now stood as a symbol, one whose every word was treated like a command from above, and whose approach sent more dread through enemy lines than an entire column of knights. But mortal flesh, however touched by celestial favor, remained subject to earthly limitations that even miracles could not transcend forever. The voices that had guided her through impossible victories began to speak of sufferings yet to come, of a mission that would demand the ultimate sacrifice before God's purpose could be fulfilled. Charles himself, secure now upon the throne that her efforts had won for him, discovered that anointed kings faced constraints unknown to desperate pretenders. The nobles who had rallied to his cause during the dark days at Bourges now offered counsel shaped by centuries of political experience, reminding their sovereign that kingdoms were governed through diplomacy as well as warfare. The English still held Paris and much of northern territory, while Burgundian power remained unbroken despite recent defeats. Prudence suggested consolidation rather than continued aggression, negotiation rather than the relentless campaign that his supernatural commander advocated. The royal council that gathered in the Loire castles bore little resemblance to the desperate assemblies that had authorized her original mission. These were men who had learned statecraft in the traditional manner, through years of careful maneuvering among competing interests and conflicting loyalties. They viewed her influence over the newly crowned king with unease that bordered upon alarm, recognizing that her authority derived from sources they could neither control nor completely understand. A peasant girl who spoke as if heaven itself whispered in her ear posed threats to established order that no amount of military success could justify. Georges de la Trémouille, the king's chief minister, emerged as the most formidable opponent of continued offensive operations. This was a man whose family had served the crown for generations, whose understanding of royal finance exceeded that of most merchants, and whose diplomatic connections stretched throughout Europe. He argued with compelling logic that the recent victories had achieved everything that reasonable strategy could hope to accomplish. The Dauphin had been crowned, English prestige had been shattered, and Burgundian resolve was wavering. Further campaigns would risk these gains for uncertain benefits, while draining a treasury that could ill afford the expenses of prolonged warfare. What followed was a clash of views that laid bare opposing beliefs about the essence of the struggle and the paths to peace. She insisted that divine command required the complete expulsion of foreign occupation, that compromise with enemies of the realm constituted betrayal of the celestial mission that had made victory possible. The councillors responded with patient explanations of political reality, reminding all who would listen that kings must consider consequences beyond the immediate results of battlefield triumphs. "Gentle king," she pleaded during audiences that grew increasingly tense as summer advanced toward autumn. "The King of Heaven has not sent me to crown you, merely that you might rule over half a realm. The English must be driven beyond the sea, and Paris must acknowledge your sovereignty before my mission can be considered complete." Her words carried the authority of absolute conviction, but they fell upon ears that had grown attuned to more complex harmonies than the simple melodies of divine command. The compromise that emerged satisfied no one while offering something to all parties concerned. She would be permitted to continue military operations, but on a reduced scale that would not strain royal resources or risk the gains already achieved. The king would provide support for limited campaigns, while reserving the right to pursue diplomatic solutions that might accomplish through negotiation what warfare had begun through force of arms. The arrangement guaranteed continued conflict between civilian and military authority, while ensuring that neither would possess sufficient strength to dominate completely. In late August, the push toward Paris was underway, led by an army whose limited size and mixed composition revealed the pressures behind the scenes. Where the force that had broken the siege of Orléans had numbered thousands of enthusiastic volunteers convinced of divine favor, the expedition against the capital commanded fewer men whose motivation derived more from professional obligation than religious fervor. The nobles who accompanied her did so from duty rather than conviction, while the common soldiers served for wages that arrived irregularly and in amounts that reflected royal reluctance more than royal generosity. Paris itself presented challenges that no previous target had posed. This was not a frontier fortress held by foreign garrisons, but the ancient heart of the realm populated by citizens whose loyalties had been shaped by decades of English administration. The university, once the jewel of European learning, had become a center of support for the occupying forces, its doctors and masters arguing that legitimate authority rested with those who could provide security and justice rather than those who claimed hereditary right. The merchants who had grown prosperous under foreign rule had little incentive to support changes that might disrupt profitable arrangements. The defences of the capital had been strengthened systematically since the English conquest, transforming medieval walls into positions capable of withstanding the most modern siege techniques. Cannon bristled from towers that had been reinforced with earth and stone, while ditches had been deepened and widened until they resembled small rivers that no assault force could hope to cross without suffering devastating casualties. The garrison commanded by Bedford himself numbered seasoned veterans whose confidence had been restored through careful attention to their material needs and their professional pride. Launched on the Nativity of the Virgin, September 8th, the assault opened with promising success. Echoes of past triumphs seemed to stir in every advance. The forces fighting under the White Banner succeeded in capturing several of the outer fortifications, driving English defenders back toward the main walls, while inspiring their own troops with displays of courage that recalled the great days at Orléans and Patay. For several hours, it appeared that divine favor would once again overcome earthly obstacles through the application of supernatural will to human conflict. But the defense proved more resilient than any the attackers had previously encountered. English engineers had learned from their earlier defeats, adapting their tactics to counter the psychological advantages that her presence provided to enemy forces. When the assault reached the main ditches surrounding the capital's walls, it met resistance organized with professional skill and maintained with the determination of men who understood that retreat would mean the loss of everything they had spent years building. The crossbow bolt that struck her down came from the walls of Saint-Honoré, fired by a marksman whose identity would never be known, but whose aim changed the course of European history. The projectile pierced her thigh with force sufficient to drive her from her horse, sending her crashing to the earth while her followers watched in horror as their seemingly invulnerable leader proved subject to the same mortality that claimed ordinary soldiers. The white banner that had led them through impossible victories suddenly lay trampled in mud-stained red, with the blood of the woman who had made them believe that God fought on their side. While the injury posed no threat to her life, its effect on morale and spirit far outweighed the physical pain. Soldiers who had followed her through triumphs that defied military logic found their faith shaken by visible proof that she could be hurt like any common fighter. The assault that had begun with supernatural confidence collapsed into confused retreat, as men who had learned to expect miracles discovered that heroism alone was insufficient against well-prepared defenses manned by professional soldiers. Paris's failure was more than a lost battle. It marked the onset of changes that would pose greater danger to her than open war ever had. Where previous setbacks had been temporary obstacles overcome through renewed effort and deeper faith, this defeat suggested that divine favor might have limitations that no amount of piety could transcend. The voices that had spoken with such clarity during the early campaigns began to offer warnings rather than promises, speaking of trials ahead that would test faith more severely than any physical suffering. Their path back to the Loire was shadowed by conflict within, as frustration turned to mutual blame and wary glances. The military commanders who had opposed the assault blamed political interference for their failure, while the civilian councillors pointed to tactical mistakes as evidence that supernatural inspiration was insufficient for the complexities of modern warfare. She found herself caught between these factions, her authority undermined by defeat, while her mission remained incomplete according to the divine mandate that had brought her from Domremy. What had been a court of celebration at Reims was now a place of caution and calculation, barely recognizable to those returning from the field. Victory had revealed divisions that success had temporarily concealed, while failure brought these conflicts into open confrontation that threatened the unity so painfully achieved through months of careful effort. The king himself seemed torn between loyalty to the woman who had won his crown and obligations to advisors whose counsel promised stability rather than continued upheaval. Winter brought a pause in active operations that allowed all parties to reconsider their positions and priorities. She spent these months in prayer and preparation, seeking guidance from celestial voices that grew increasingly cryptic in their communications. The simple clarity of her original mission, lift the siege, crown the king, had been replaced by warnings of betrayal and suffering, prophecies of capture and martyrdom that cast shadows over every conversation and darkened the meaning of previous triumphs. The nobility who had once competed for the honor of serving under her command now found urgent business elsewhere when new campaigns were proposed. These were practical men who understood that association with failure could prove more dangerous than physical wounds, while connection to suspected heresy might cost them more than military defeat could ever threaten. The enthusiasm that had made her early victories possible evaporated like morning mist before the cold winds of political calculation. Spring arrived with news that English forces were preparing major offensives designed to reclaim territories lost during the previous year's campaigns. Bedford had used the winter respite to reorganize his armies and restore the confidence that defeats at Orléans and Patay had shattered among his subordinates. Fresh troops arrived from across the Channel, while new commanders brought tactical innovations designed to counter the psychological advantages that her presence had previously provided to enemy forces. Unlike the triumphant advances that had earned her renown, this new campaign moved with uncertainty, marked by setbacks rather than soaring victories. Instead of the coordinated advance of large armies supported by royal resources, she found herself leading relatively small forces whose objectives were limited to local successes rather than strategic transformation. The towns that fell to her attacks, Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier and La Charité-sur-Loire, represented tactical victories that failed to achieve the psychological impact of her earlier triumphs. At Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, the assault succeeded only after repeated attempts that cost far more in casualties than previous victories had required. The defenders, emboldened by reports of her failure at Paris, offered resistance that forced her troops to employ conventional siege tactics rather than relying upon the supernatural inspiration that had once made walls crumble at her approach. The town fell eventually, but the manner of its capture suggested that divine favor was either diminishing or being countered by more effective enemy preparations. At La Charité, the campaign proved even more grueling, stretching out over weeks before concluding not with victory, but with a forced withdrawal. For the first time since her arrival at Chinon, she faced the bitter experience of absolute failure, watching her forces retreat from objectives that once would have fallen within days of her appearance before their walls. The defeat was not merely military, but spiritual, calling into question the very foundation of her authority, while providing enemies with evidence that her power was not unlimited. Through the darkness of those months, the voices continued, and their cautions became more pointed, more precise, with time. St. Michael told her that she would be captured before Midsummer Day, that her mission would be completed through suffering rather than triumph, that the salvation of the realm would require sacrifices greater than any she had yet been called upon to make. The prophecies filled her with dread while strengthening her resolve to accomplish whatever remained of divine purpose, before mortal limitations brought her earthly service to an end. When the summons came to defend Compiègne in May 1430, it felt less like a call to arms and more like the moment her prophecy demanded: deliverance or destruction. The town commanded strategic importance far beyond its size, controlling river crossings that could determine the success or failure of English campaigns throughout the region. Its fall would open pathways that might carry foreign armies deep into territory that had been secured through years of careful effort, while its successful defense might restore confidence in supernatural protection that recent failures had undermined. Fewer than 400 marched with her into what would be the last stand, a mix of faithful veterans and hired fighters bound more by pay than belief. The army that had once followed her banner in thousands had dwindled to this small band of the faithful, while the nobles who had competed for her favor now found pressing obligations that prevented their participation in what everyone recognized might prove to be a desperate venture. The approach to Compiègne took her through countryside that bore witness to the devastation that a century of warfare had inflicted upon the realm. Abandoned villages marked the passage of armies, whose foraging had left nothing for subsequent travelers, while burned churches testified to the breakdown of sacred restraints that had once protected non-combatants from the full fury of military violence. The roads themselves were barely passable, their stones scattered by the wheels of countless baggage trains and their bridges destroyed by engineers who understood that mobility could serve defensive as well as offensive purposes. On the 23rd day of May, as her voices had prophesied with accuracy that no earthly intelligence could have provided, the trap finally closed around the woman who had changed the course of history through faith that moved mountains and courage that had seemed to transcend human limitations. The skirmish outside Compiègne's walls began as a routine engagement between small forces, but ended with the capture of the most famous warrior in Christendom by enemies who understood her value far better than allies who had grown weary of supporting missions that no longer guaranteed success. She faced the impossible odds with the same calm courage that had carried her through previous battles, fighting until superior numbers made resistance futile, rather than surrendering while escape remained possible. When Burgundian hands finally seized her bridle and dragged her from the saddle, she knew that the earthly phase of her mission had ended, and the spiritual trials foretold by her voices were about to begin. Her capture was known across enemy lines, before her captors could finish bargaining over the sum that would seal her destiny. In castles and courts throughout Europe, men understood that the balance of power had shifted once again, though none could predict whether her martyrdom would prove more dangerous to English interests than her continued existence had been to their military operations. Rising skyward like a grim monument, the tower at Beaurevoir held walls so thick they swallowed the prayers of the most celebrated prisoner of the age. Within a chamber barely large enough for a bed and a prie-dieu, the maid who had crowned kings and broken armies found herself reduced to counting the stones in walls that would never feel her touch again. The Burgundians who held her understood the value of their prize, not merely a military commander or a political symbol, but the living embodiment of hopes that had sustained a nation through its darkest hour. Philippe de Ligny, her immediate captor, treated his prisoner with the courtesy due to nobility, while maintaining the vigilance required for someone whose escape might shift the balance of power throughout Christendom. The chambers assigned to her were comfortable by the standards of medieval captivity. Tapestries warmed the stone walls, braziers provided heat against the autumn chill, and servants brought meals that bore no resemblance to campaign rations or siege bread. But comfort could not disguise the reality that she had become a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The bidding began before the dust had settled at Compiègne. English gold flowed northward like water seeking its level, while diplomatic pouches carried offers that would have ransomed entire kingdoms. Henry VI's council understood that their prisoner represented more than mere military advantage. She embodied the divine legitimacy that had transformed a disinherited prince into an anointed sovereign. Her destruction would strike at the very foundations of renewed royal authority, while her preservation posed threats that no amount of conventional force could address. From Chinon came silence that spoke louder than any ransom demand. The royal treasury that had funded her campaigns suddenly discovered pressing obligations elsewhere, while courtiers who had basked in the reflected glory of her victories found urgent business that prevented them from addressing her plight. Charles himself, that sovereign she had placed upon his throne through divine inspiration and earthly sacrifice, seemed to have forgotten the debt that no amount of gold could repay. No wound of flesh could match the pain of being forsaken. She had expected capture as a possibility of warfare, imprisonment as a hazard of her profession, even death as the price of serving causes greater than personal safety. But the betrayal by those she had lifted from despair to triumph violated assumptions about human nature that her celestial voices had never prepared her to question. Kings, it seemed, possessed shorter memories than peasants when gratitude conflicted with convenience. Jean de Luxembourg, Count of Ligny and vassal to the Duke of Burgundy, found himself thrust into negotiations that would determine the fate of Europe's most controversial prisoner. His own inclinations favored treating her with the honor due to a captured commander, but political realities demanded recognition that mercy was a luxury no one could afford. The English wanted her delivered to face charges of heresy and witchcraft. The Burgundians needed English gold to fund their ongoing conflicts. The royal court maintained studied neutrality that protected their investment in legitimacy while avoiding financial obligations. As the talks inched forward through the warm months and into the cold, she remained in the dark, cut off from the decisions sealing her future. She spent her days in prayer and contemplation, writing letters that would never be delivered to supporters who might already have forgotten her existence. The voices that had guided her through triumph and defeat had fallen silent since her capture, leaving her to face the approaching storm with only human courage and divine faith as protection against powers that sought her destruction. Autumn brought the first serious attempt at escape, planned with the same tactical intelligence that had broken the siege of Orléans and crowned a king at Reims. The tower room possessed a window barely wide enough for a slender person to squeeze through, while the walls offered handholds that might support someone desperate enough to risk everything upon a single throw of fortune's dice. On the feast of Saint Michael, her first celestial advisor, she made the attempt that nearly cost her life and certainly sealed her fate. The fall should have killed her. 60 feet of empty air separated her window from the courtyard below, a distance that had claimed the lives of stronger persons attempting less desperate escapes. She struck the earth with impact that drove consciousness from her body and left her lying motionless while guards raised the alarm throughout the fortress. For hours, her captors believed they would face the inconvenience of explaining how their prize had cheated both justice and injustice through self-destruction. But she survived, battered and unconscious, but breathing still when physicians arrived to assess the damage. The injuries were severe enough to prevent another escape attempt, while remaining insufficient to excuse her from the justice that English gold had already purchased. Her recovery took weeks, during which time the final negotiations proceeded toward their inevitable conclusion. 10,000 livres tournois changed hands, a sum that could have equipped an army or built a cathedral, paid as the price of one peasant girl whose influence had proven more dangerous than enemy legions. She was handed over to English custody on a November morning. The land, veiled in frost like a shroud, lay gently across the fading year. She rode in chains for the first time since her capture, iron bonds that clanked with each step of her horse and announced to all who saw the procession that the Maid of Orleans had become the prisoner of Rouen. The escort that surrounded her numbered 300 men-at-arms, testimony to English respect for her ability to inspire devotion even in captivity. Rouen received its famous prisoner with the mixed emotions of a city that had learned to live under foreign rule, while remembering better days when different banners had flown from its walls. The English administration had transformed the ancient capital of Normandy into a fortress of occupation, its streets patrolled by soldiers whose accents betrayed their origins across the narrow sea. Within the castle that dominated the city, preparations had been underway for months to conduct the trial that would either legitimize English conquest or provide their enemies with a martyred saint. Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, awaited his famous prisoner with the patience of a man whose entire career had led to this singular opportunity. His loyalty to English interests was beyond question. He owed his episcopal dignity to English support, his temporal authority to English arms, and his future prospects to English favour. The trial over which he would preside represented more than mere ecclesiastical justice. It offered the chance to demonstrate that divine judgment favoured those who served the proper authorities. The preliminary examinations began within days of her arrival, conducted in chambers where the balance of power was made visible through every detail of arrangement. She sat alone on a simple stool, while around her gathered the representatives of earthly and celestial authority, doctors of theology whose learning exceeded that of most bishops, lawyers whose knowledge of canon law had been tested in the highest courts of Christendom, and judges whose impartiality was guaranteed by their dependence upon English favour. They assembled charges that spanned the full spectrum of medieval crimes, casting her as a threat to both church and crown. Heresy topped the list. The claim that she had received direct revelation from heaven without the mediation of ecclesiastical authority. Witchcraft followed closely. The assertion that her victories had been accomplished through commerce with demons rather than divine inspiration. Blasphemy, apostasy, and schism rounded out the theological accusations, while secular charges included treason, rebellion, and the wearing of male attire in violation of divine commandment. Each accusation carried the penalty of death, though the specific manner of execution would depend upon her response to opportunities for repentance. Heretics who maintained their errors unto the end faced burning as the only fire capable of purging souls contaminated by falsehood. Those who confessed their crimes and submitted to ecclesiastical authority might hope for the mercy of the sword or the rope, quicker deaths that acknowledged their return to Christian fellowship. The choice between these fates would depend upon answers to questions that had been crafted with the precision of snares designed to capture the wariest prey. The interrogations themselves revealed the extraordinary character that had made her famous throughout Christendom. Where learned men expected to find a simple peasant girl overwhelmed by proceedings beyond her understanding, they encountered an opponent whose intelligence matched their scholarship and whose faith exceeded their theological sophistication. Her responses to their carefully prepared questions displayed a grasp of spiritual matters that should have required decades of formal education to acquire. "By what right do you claim to have been sent by God?" demanded Jean d'Estivée, the prosecutor whose reputation had been built upon the destruction of heretics and rebels. "By the same right that enabled Moses to lead Israel from bondage, she replied without hesitation, and by which Samuel anointed David king over the chosen people. God speaks to whom he will, when he will, through means that please him rather than those that please men. To the assembled doctors, her words broke across the room like a storm's lightning, brilliant and undeniable against the darkness of doubt. She had claimed not merely divine inspiration, but direct commission from the Almighty, bypassing ecclesiastical authority entirely, while invoking biblical precedents that no Christian could dismiss without embracing heresy themselves. The trap they had set for her had become a snare for their own presumptions, forcing them to choose between accepting her claims or denying the validity of scriptural revelation itself. Question after question revealed the same pattern. Responses that demonstrated extraordinary learning combined with unshakable faith. Answers that turned prosecution into apology and accusation into admission. When they demanded to know by what authority she wore male attire, she quoted Deuteronomy, while noting that necessity had compelled her to adopt protection against the violence that awaited women traveling among soldiers. When they questioned her certainty of salvation, she replied with the subtlety of a trained theologian that she trusted in God's mercy while acknowledging that presumption was itself a sin. The physical conditions of her imprisonment grew harsher as her intellectual resistance proved more formidable than her captors had anticipated. The chamber where she was held lay within the castle's military section rather than the ecclesiastical quarters, making her technically a prisoner of war rather than a defendant in religious proceedings. English soldiers guarded her door day and night, men whose loyalty to their cause was reinforced by tales of her supernatural powers, and whose fear expressed itself through petty cruelties that canon law should have prevented. Iron chains bound her ankles to the bed where she slept, while shackles around her wrists made even the simplest movements awkward and painful. The male guards who watched her every action violated every precedent of ecclesiastical jurisprudence, which demanded that accused persons of her gender be attended by women of proven virtue. But English authorities understood that conventional imprisonment would not suffice for a prisoner whose past escapes had demonstrated ingenuity that bordered upon the miraculous. While snow gathered outside and wind rattled the towers, the interrogations dragged on, relentless, calculated to drain her strength when words alone could not. Each session brought new questions calculated to trap her in contradictions that would justify condemnation. New theological problems that should have exceeded the capacity of peasant understanding to resolve. But each session also revealed the magnitude of divine favor that had made her victories possible, demonstrating that human learning was insufficient to contend with inspiration drawn directly from celestial sources. Her responses began to be copied and circulated throughout European universities, where scholars recognized the presence of wisdom that transcended formal education. The transcripts that survived revealed a mind capable of distinguishing between essential and accidental elements of faith, between divine commandments and human traditions, between the authority of Scripture and the presumptions of those who claim to interpret its meaning. Such sophistication should have required decades of study to achieve, suggesting that her claims of supernatural guidance might contain more truth than her enemies were prepared to acknowledge. The political pressure surrounding the trial increased as winter gave way towards spring. English administrators understood that prolonged proceedings were generating more sympathy for the prisoner than swift condemnation would have accomplished. Throughout the territory, under their control, common folk whispered that if the maid were truly guilty of the crimes charged against her, learned doctors would not require months to prove what should have been obvious from the beginning. news from the continuing war added urgency to demands for resolution. The royal forces, fighting now without their supernatural commander, had nonetheless maintained the momentum that her victories had created. English positions throughout the Loire Valley remained under pressure from armies that fought with confidence born of recent success, while Burgundian allies began to reconsider commitments that seemed increasingly disadvantageous. The prisoner's continued existence served as a rallying point for resistance that her martyrdom might actually strengthen rather than eliminate. In the end, the trap that succeeded where theology had failed was a cruel choice. Two paths offered, both ending in ruin. She could confess her crimes and accept life imprisonment, acknowledging that her voices had been demonic delusions and her victories accomplished through witchcraft. Or she could maintain her innocence and face execution as an unrepentant heretic whose errors posed continuing danger to Christian faith. Either choice would serve English purposes. Confession would delegitimize the coronation at Reims, while martyrdom would eliminate the source of supernatural resistance. The document they prepared for her signature had been crafted with the skill of lawyers who understood that complexity could accomplish what simplicity could not achieve. Written in Latin rather than the vernacular tongue she understood, filled with technical terminology that obscured its true meaning, the confession appeared to offer mercy while actually constituting admission of every charge brought against her. The promise of imprisonment rather than execution seemed generous to one who faced the flames, but the spiritual implications were more devastating than any physical punishment. Standing in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, before a crowd that included representatives of every estate in Normandy, she listened to sermons that painted her choices in stark terms, while crowds murmured prayers and curses in equal measure. The stake had been prepared and waiting, its wood seasoned to burn hot and fast, its chains ready to receive a prisoner whose destruction would serve as warning to all who might claim direct communication with heaven. The alternative offered salvation of the body through destruction of everything that had made her life meaningful. Fear of the flames finally accomplished what months of interrogation had not achieved. With trembling hand, she signed the document that condemned her voices as demonic inspiration and her mission as diabolical delusion. The crowd that witnessed her submission erupted in confused celebration, some rejoicing that a dangerous heretic had returned to Christian fellowship, while others mourned that a saint had been compelled to deny the source of her sanctity. But the victory her enemies had purchased through psychological torture proved shorter-lived than the flames they had postponed. Within days, confined to a cell where English guards reminded her hourly of her degradation, she began to understand the true cost of the survival she had purchased through compromise. The document she had signed had not merely saved her life. It had declared everything she had accomplished to be the work of demons, transforming liberation into damnation and coronation into usurpation. When the guards arrived on the morning of Trinity Sunday to find her wearing male attire once again, they knew that the reprieve was over. She had recanted her recantation, choosing the flames over the living death of denying everything that gave her existence meaning. "My voices were from God," she declared to the court that reconvened to hear her final testimony. "I have done nothing against God or the faith, whatever I may have said or done." They pronounced her fate that day, condemning her as one who had returned to heresy, thus nullifying the sincerity of her prior admission of guilt. The execution was scheduled for the following morning, allowing barely enough time for last-minute appeals that everyone knew would never come. Her enemies had captured her body, but they had learned too late that her silence they could never purchase at any price. They could not unmake her past, so they tried to destroy her name. On May 30th, the sun rose clean and sharp over Rouen, lighting up the square where townspeople had once bartered for food, now the stage for something far heavier. The scaffold rose like an altar erected for the darkest mass, its timbers seasoned oak that would burn hot and clean. Its platform raised high enough that all the assembled thousands could witness the final act of a tragedy that had begun in the fields of Domremy and would end in flames that would consume flesh while kindling a legend that no fire could extinguish. Before the sun had risen, the crowds were already forming, lured by the spectacle that would feed fireside stories for generations to come. These were not merely bloodthirsty peasants seeking entertainment at the expense of another's suffering, but representatives of every station in society who understood that they were about to witness an event that would echo through the ages. English soldiers maintained order with the professional competence of men who had learned crowd control through years of occupation duty, while French citizens watched with the complex emotions of those who had lived too long under foreign rule to remember clearly what independence had felt like. In her cell within the castle, she prepared for death with the same methodical attention to duty that had characterized her approach to every challenge since the voices first called her from her father's fields. The male attire that had provided her captors with their final excuse for condemnation lay folded beside the simple dress that ecclesiastical mercy had provided for her last hours on earth. The transformation from warrior to penitent seemed complete, yet those who observed her preparations noted that surrender of worldly symbols had not diminished the inner light that had made her famous throughout Christendom. Brother Martin Ladvenu, the Dominican friar who had been assigned to hear her final confession, found himself facing a spiritual challenge that his theological training had never prepared him to address. Here was a woman condemned as a heretic by the highest ecclesiastical authorities, acknowledged as a relapsed criminal by courts whose competence none dared question, proven guilty of offences that demanded the ultimate penalty according to canon law that had governed Christendom for centuries. But the words she spoke in the privacy of the confessional carried conviction that no amount of legal condemnation could shake, revealing a soul whose purity seemed to mock the very proceedings that had brought her to this final extremity. "Father," she whispered, as the morning light strengthened beyond her window, "I forgive my enemies, as Christ forgave those who nailed him to the cross, the English who have brought me to this pass, the judges who have condemned me, the king who has abandoned me. All are instruments of divine will, though they know it not. My death will serve God's purpose as surely as my victories served his glory, and I go to the flames with joy, knowing that suffering shared with Christ is privilege beyond earthly understanding." The procession that formed to conduct her to the marketplace moved with the solemnity of a religious ceremony, which in many ways it was. 800 English soldiers provided escort through streets lined with citizens whose silence spoke more eloquently than any cheers or curses could have done. The cart that carried her lurched over stones, worn smooth by centuries of traffic, each jolt a reminder of the mortality she was about to embrace, while thousands watched and wondered whether they were witnessing justice or martyrdom. She rode without bonds, her hands free to clasp the wooden cross that Brother Martin had provided for her comfort. The simple crucifix seemed to capture and reflect the morning sunlight, transforming cheap wood into something that glowed like precious metal in the hands of one who had learned to find treasure in the most humble circumstances. Her face, according to witnesses whose testimony would survive the centuries, bore no trace of fear or regret, but only the peace that comes to those who have surrendered earthly attachments in favor of celestial promises. For the occasion, Rouen marketplace had become a stage, set for the final scene of her life to play out before a crowd that represented all of Christendom. Diplomatic observers from a dozen courts mingled with merchants and artisans, while clergy, whose theological sophistication rivaled that of university masters, stood beside common priests whose learning extended little beyond the ceremonies of their calling. All had come to witness the end of a story that had captivated Europe for 2 years, though none could predict whether her death would close the book or merely begin a new chapter. 12 feet tall, the stake loomed over the platform, its iron chains set to bind the most well-known prisoner alive. The wood piled around its base had been arranged with professional skill by executioners who understood their craft. Seasoned timber that would kindle quickly and burn with flames hot enough to accomplish their purpose without unnecessary prolongation of suffering. The arrangement spoke of mercy within justice, efficiency within ceremony, the kind of careful preparation that marked the difference between civilized execution and barbarous murder. Pierre Cochon mounted the platform with the measured dignity of a man whose entire career had led to this moment of vindication. The bishop's robes caught the morning breeze as he unfolded the parchment that contained the final sentence, his voice carrying across the marketplace with authority that no one dared question. The crimes he enumerated had been proven through months of careful legal proceeding, witnessed by scholars whose learning none disputed, confirmed by processes that followed every requirement of canon law. What would follow was not revenge, but justice, not murder, but necessary purification of the church from contamination that threatened the very foundations of Christian order. Jeanne, commonly called the Maid, he proclaimed, employing the legal formulation that reduced the most famous woman in Europe to a category suitable for judicial disposal. You have been found guilty of heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, and numerous other crimes against God and his holy church, having relapsed into error after previous confession and repentance. You are hereby delivered to the secular arm for punishment according to law, with the prayer that mercy may temper justice in the execution of this sentence. The response that followed would be remembered long after the names of her judges had been forgotten by all save historians with professional interest in the machinery of medieval justice. Instead of the pleas for mercy that most condemned criminals offered at such moments, instead of the curses and imprecations that might have been expected from one facing such a fate, she spoke words that transformed condemnation into testimony and execution into martyrdom. "My lords of the church," she said, her voice clear enough to carry to the farthest edges of the crowd, "I die forgiving all who have brought me to this pass, praying that God will have mercy upon their souls as I trust he will have mercy upon mine. The voices that guided me came from heaven, not hell, and the works they commanded me to perform were accomplished for the glory of God and the salvation of the realm he loves. If I have erred, it was in understanding, not in will, and I submit myself to his judgment rather than to that of men who mistake their authority for his wisdom." Like lightning tearing through a midnight sky, the words jolted the crowd, exposing in an instant what this moment truly meant. This was not the execution of a dangerous criminal, but the martyrdom of a saint whose only crime had been claiming direct communication with heaven. The silence that followed her declaration was broken only by the sound of weeping from citizens who suddenly understood that they were about to witness an atrocity that would stain their city's reputation for centuries to come. There was no venom in the way she was secured to the stake, only the detached expertise of those used to the task. The chains that secured her to the iron post had been designed to hold the strongest man while allowing enough movement to prevent immediate unconsciousness from strangulation. The paper cap that was placed upon her head bore inscriptions that proclaimed her crimes to any who could read, while the placard hung around her neck announced to the illiterate that here suffered a relapsed heretic whose errors had brought her to deserved punishment. Through all these preparations, she maintained the composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the long months of trial and imprisonment. When the executioner approached with the torch that would kindle the flames, she requested that the wooden cross be held where she could see it, that her eyes might rest upon the symbol of salvation, rather than the faces of those who had brought her to this extremity. The simple request, granted by Brother Martin with hands that trembled as he positioned the crucifix, humanized the proceedings in ways that formal ceremonies could not disguise. The fire caught quickly, fed by wood that had been prepared with professional skill and kindled by hands that had learned their trade through years of practice. The flames rose with hungry efficiency, consuming the straw and kindling that surrounded the base of the stake, while crowds watched in fascination that mixed horror with admiration. Within moments, smoke began to obscure the figure at the center of the pyre, though her voice could still be heard above the crackling of burning wood and the murmur of thousands who witnessed her final testimony. Jesus, she called, employing the name that had sustained her through triumphs and defeats, victories and failures, the brief glory of coronation and the long agony of imprisonment. The word escaped her lips like a prayer made audible, repeated with increasing urgency as the flames climbed higher and the smoke grew thicker. 6 times she pronounced the name that meant salvation, 6 invocations that pierced the morning air like arrows aimed at heaven itself. Lifted where the smoke couldn't reach it, the banner she'd requested waved, white silk bearing the same images that had carried troops to triumph and turned a village girl into a holy force. In the shifting light of the flames, the painted angels seemed to move with life of their own, their wings spreading wide enough to shelter kingdoms while their faces bore expressions of sorrow that no human artist could have imagined. The device that had once struck terror into English hearts now served as a beacon of hope for all who believed that earthly injustice was temporary, while celestial justice was eternal. Even the most experienced witnesses were taken aback by how quickly it was finished. The flames, fed by wind that seemed to arise from nowhere, leaped higher than expected, consuming their victim with an efficiency that spoke either of divine mercy or diabolical haste. The voice that had called upon Jesus fell silent as smoke obscured the stake entirely, leaving only the crackling of fire and the murmur of crowds to mark the passing of the most famous woman in Christendom. Though long accustomed to the agony of his trade, the executioner later admitted to Brother Martin that he had never seen anything like what unfolded that morning in Rouen. The flames, he swore, had burned with unusual intensity around the stake, while leaving the surrounding platform untouched. More disturbing still was his discovery, when the fire had cooled sufficiently to permit examination, that her heart remained intact despite the complete consumption of everything else, beating visibly within the ashes as if life persisted beyond the destruction of mortal flesh. Her body was dealt with in a way that left no chance for relics, every step taken to block her followers from turning memory into martyrdom. The ashes were gathered with meticulous care and cast into the Seine, their dispersal witnessed by officials whose testimony would prevent any claims that portions had been preserved for veneration. The heart that had refused to burn was thrown into the river with the rest, though many who watched swore that it glowed like a coal even as the waters closed over it. As they drifted from the square, the people bore with them memories too vivid for any king to silence, and truths no priest could rewrite. What they had witnessed was not the triumph of justice over error, but the martyrdom of innocence by forces that feared the challenge her example posed to their authority. The silence that had marked her final moments was broken by conversations that began immediately and would continue for centuries. Debates about the nature of divine inspiration and the limits of human judgment that her death had raised rather than resolved. News of the execution spread across Europe with the speed that only momentous events could achieve, carried by merchants and pilgrims whose tales grew more extraordinary with each telling. In the courts of princes and the halls of universities, learned men debated the theological implications of what had occurred, while common folk in village taverns and urban workshops spoke of miracles witnessed and prophecies fulfilled. The woman who had been condemned as a heretic was already being venerated as a saint by those who understood that human courts could err, while divine justice was infallible. The political consequences of her death proved far different from what her enemies had anticipated. Instead of ending resistance to English occupation, her martyrdom provided that resistance with a rallying point more powerful than any living leader could have offered. The flame that had consumed her body kindled fires of rebellion throughout territory that English arms had conquered, but English administration had never truly controlled. Charles himself, that king she had placed upon his throne through divine inspiration and earthly sacrifice, received word of her death with emotions that chroniclers struggled to describe. The man who had remained silent during her imprisonment, who had offered no ransom for her release, who had abandoned to her fate the woman who had won his crown, was said to have wept openly when informed that the Maid of Orleans would trouble his counsels no more. What had seemed a final victory for the English leaders quickly turned bitter, as unrest flared once more across the lands they thought subdued. The woman they had killed to end supernatural opposition had become a supernatural force, more dangerous in death than she had ever been in life. Her martyrdom had provided the French cause with something no military victory could have achieved: absolute moral authority in a conflict that had previously been conducted according to the brutal arithmetic of conquest and submission. In the Cathedral of Reims, where she had stood beside the altar as Charles received the crown that made him rightful sovereign of the realm, special masses were offered for the repose of her soul, while priests who had witnessed her coronation prayed for the salvation of one whose sanctity seemed beyond question, despite the condemnation of ecclesiastical courts. The contradiction between her obvious holiness and her legal guilt created theological problems that would require decades to resolve and centuries to fully understand. Not long after the flames died down in Rouen, people across Normandy began to speak of wonders, small at first, but impossible to ignore. Peasants who had witnessed the execution returned to their villages, speaking of signs and wonders that no earthly power could explain. Flames that had burned with supernatural intensity while leaving her cross untouched. A heart that refused to be consumed despite the complete destruction of everything else. And a silence that had fallen over the assembled thousands, as if heaven itself mourned the passing of one of its chosen servants. In the Abbey of Saint-Ouen, where she had signed the confession that her enemies claimed proved her guilt, the monks who had maintained careful neutrality during the trial found themselves recording events that challenged every assumption about divine justice and human authority. Brother Guillaume Manchon, who had served as notary during the proceedings, preserved transcripts that revealed the extraordinary theological sophistication of responses that should have been beyond the capacity of peasant understanding. These documents, hidden away from English authorities who preferred simpler narratives, would eventually provide evidence that the condemned woman had possessed wisdom that transcended formal education. Rather than bringing stability, her execution seemed to hasten the collapse of the military situation the English commanders had hoped to control. Garrisons that had held their positions through years of French pressure suddenly found themselves facing attacks launched with desperate fury by soldiers who fought not merely for territorial advantage, but for the honor of a martyred saint. The white banners that appeared on distant hillsides carried images that seemed to move in the shifting light, while battle cries that invoked her name struck English hearts with terror that no amount of professional training could overcome. At Compiègne, where she had been captured, the garrison that had purchased her freedom through betrayal discovered that their investment had brought them nothing but the undying hatred of citizens who had once accepted occupation with resigned patience. The English soldiers who had paid Burgundian gold for possession of the most famous prisoner in Christendom found themselves defending walls against attackers who seemed to possess supernatural protection. Every assault was preceded by masses for the repose of her soul, every victory celebrated with hymns that proclaimed her sanctity, while cursing those who had brought her to martyrdom. Charles himself, secure upon the throne that her sacrifice had won for him, faced the most complex challenge of his reign as he struggled to balance political necessity against moral obligation. The king who had remained silent during her trial now confronted demands from subjects who insisted that royal honor required some acknowledgement of the debt that no amount of gold could repay. Diplomatic representatives from friendly courts brought word that her execution had damaged royal prestige throughout Christendom, while domestic advisors warned that continued silence might be interpreted as acceptance of English claims that the coronation at Reims had been accomplished through demonic intervention. Slow and deliberate, the royal response was moulded by political strategy, navigating English power, Burgundian pressure, and a swelling public demand for justice. Official statements described her as a faithful servant who had deserved better treatment from enemies, whose fear had overcome their judgment, while carefully avoiding direct challenges to ecclesiastical authority that might provoke unwanted confrontations with church hierarchy. The language was diplomatic enough to avoid offense while remaining vague enough to permit multiple interpretations. But beneath the surface of official caution, more substantive preparations were underway. Royal agents began collecting testimony from those who had known her before fame transformed a peasant girl into an international symbol, gathering evidence that might eventually support formal challenges to the verdict that had condemned her. The process required utmost discretion, since premature revelation might provoke English retaliation against witnesses whose cooperation was essential for any future proceedings. The investigation that followed her death revealed the systematic irregularities that had characterized the trial from its inception. Scholars who examined the procedures discovered violations of canon law so fundamental that they called into question the competence of courts that had condemned her. The denial of proper counsel, the use of threats and intimidation, the holding of a female prisoner under male guards. Each violation provided grounds for appeal that ecclesiastical authorities could not ignore indefinitely. Most damaging to her prosecutors was the growing evidence that political considerations had shaped judicial decisions throughout the proceedings. The financial arrangements that had delivered her to English custody, the pressure applied to secure predetermined verdicts, the refusal to permit appeals that canon law guaranteed to all defendants. These revelations transformed what had been presented as dispassionate pursuit of theological truth into something that looked suspiciously like judicial murder. Witness after witness offered a version of her that contradicted the damning portrait painted by the authorities. Village priests who had known her family spoke of exceptional piety that had manifested itself long before any claims of divine mission. Soldiers who had served under her command described leadership that combined tactical brilliance with moral authority that no amount of military training could have provided. Nobles who had witnessed her performances at court testified to wisdom that transcended her humble origins, while maintaining humility that proved the authenticity of her calling. The rehabilitation trial that finally convened in 1455 represented more than mere legal proceeding. It was an attempt to restore moral balance to a universe that had been distorted by the triumph of expedience over justice. The The judges who presided over these new hearings understood that they were not merely reviewing the case of an individual defendant, but examining the entire system of ecclesiastical jurisprudence that had permitted such manifest injustice to masquerade as religious duty. It was as if she rose again through the words of those who knew her, each witness reviving virtues once rejected and recounting acts that could only be credited to divine help. Guillaume de Flavy, who had commanded the garrison at Compiègne when she was captured, acknowledged that his failure to prevent her seizure had haunted him for decades. Jean de Dunois, her military companion during the triumph at Orléans, described tactical innovations that had revolutionized siege warfare, while maintaining that her true strength had always been spiritual rather than technical. The rehabilitation extended beyond mere legal vindication to encompass recognition of the theological sophistication that her responses had demonstrated throughout the original trial. University masters who examined the transcripts discovered arguments that would have challenged the finest scholars of the age, insights into divine nature that suggested inspiration beyond human capacity to achieve, her defense of direct revelation, her explanations of the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority, her understanding of the proper limits of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, all revealed a mind capable of grappling with the most complex theological questions of her era. When her condemnation was officially overturned on July the 7th, 1456, it marked full vindication of everything she had said about her purpose and divine calling. The judges who issued this verdict declared that the original proceedings had been contaminated with fraud, calumny, wickedness, contradictions, and manifest errors on fact and law, while acknowledging that the woman they had rehabilitated possessed virtues that approached sanctity. The parchment that contained the original sentence was ceremonially torn and scattered to the winds, symbolically undoing an injustice that had stained the reputation of ecclesiastical courts throughout Christendom. But legal rehabilitation, however complete, could not restore a life that political calculation had sacrificed to diplomatic necessity. The woman who might have lived to see the final expulsion of English occupation, who could have witnessed the restoration of royal authority throughout the realm, who should have been honored as the liberator of her people, that woman remained in her grave, while others claimed credit for victories that her sacrifice had made possible. The shift in how she was remembered after her rehabilitation gave rise to a legend that no living person could have ever matched. Village storytellers who had never seen Rouen began to describe the execution with details that grew more miraculous with each telling, while ballad singers throughout the realm composed verses that celebrated her sanctity while cursing those who had brought her to martyrdom. The woman who had been condemned as a dangerous heretic was reimagined as a warrior saint whose example inspired resistance to tyranny wherever Christendom extended. Gone was the image of a village girl hearing whispers in the fields. In her place stood a celestial warrior, her armor aglow, angels circling above the sacred battles she commanded. These images, however removed from historical reality, captured truths about her significance that no purely factual account could convey. Her influence on subsequent military development proved equally enduring. The tactical innovations she had introduced, the emphasis on rapid assault rather than prolonged siege, the integration of artillery with infantry attacks, the use of psychological warfare to break enemy morale, became standard practice among commanders who understood that her methods had been as revolutionary as her inspiration. Military treatises, written decades after her death, still referenced techniques that she had pioneered during campaigns that lasted barely 2 years. The political legacy was more complex but equally significant. Her demonstration that divine authority could legitimize resistance to established power provided precedents that would be invoked by rebels and revolutionaries for centuries to come. The principle that heaven's will superseded earthly commands, that individual conscience could override institutional authority, that common people possessed capacity for extraordinary service. These ideas, refined through her example, would inspire challenges to hierarchical order throughout the medieval and early modern periods. It was in the realm of faith that her story and what followed left the deepest mark. The rehabilitation trial had established that direct divine revelation remained possible in an age when many theologians argued that such communication had ended with the apostolic era. Her vindications suggested that the Holy Spirit continued to work through individuals who possessed sufficient faith and purity, that institutional mediation was not always necessary for authentic religious experience. The canonization process that began centuries later would eventually confirm what popular devotion had recognized immediately, that here was a saint whose sanctity transcended the particular circumstances of her historical moment to address universal human longings for meaning and purpose. The peasant girl who had claimed friendship with archangels was officially acknowledged as one who had indeed conversed with heaven, whose prayers could intercede for all who faced impossible challenges while maintaining faith in ultimate justice. Her story found its way into classrooms throughout Europe, used to show what a life of faith could demand and achieve. University masters who had once dismissed her as an ignorant peasant whose brief fame had been founded upon political manipulation, now recognized that her theological insights had anticipated developments that formal scholarship would not achieve for decades. Her responses during interrogation were studied as models of how simple faith could confound learned skepticism while maintaining intellectual respectability. The emergence of vernacular literature celebrating her achievements marked a significant development in European cultural history. Previous saints' lives had been written primarily in Latin for clerical audiences, but stories about her appeared in every spoken language from England to Poland, making her the first genuinely international figure whose fame transcended both linguistic and political boundaries. Poets who had never seen her battlefield victories nonetheless understood that her example spoke to universal human experiences of calling and sacrifice. The French national identity that crystallized around her memory transformed her from a regional champion into the embodiment of characteristics that defined an entire people. Her courage became French courage. Her faith became French faith. Her determination to expel foreign occupation became the eternal French refusal to accept external domination. The process required considerable historical imagination, since the realm she had served bore little resemblance to the modern nation that claimed her as patroness. But symbols are more powerful than facts when communities seek to understand their collective identity. Their reaction to her vindication made clear that her story still had the power to trouble the very people who had condemned her. Official documents maintained that the original trial had been conducted according to proper legal procedures, while acknowledging that political circumstances had perhaps influenced judicial decisions in regrettable ways. The defensive tone of these statements suggested that English authorities understood they had lost the propaganda war that her execution was supposed to have won. Complicated and cautious, the Burgundian response reflected the very divisions that had influenced their part in her prosecution. Duke Philip, who had profited from her capture while maintaining plausible deniability about her ultimate fate, gradually distanced his court from association with proceedings that popular opinion had condemned as judicial murder. The diplomatic correspondence of his final years contained subtle indications that he regretted the role his subjects had played in delivering her to English justice. By the end of the 15th century, her transformation from condemned heretic to acknowledged saint was complete in everything but formal ecclesiastical recognition. Pilgrims visited the sites associated with her brief career, while relics, many of dubious authenticity, were venerated in churches throughout the realm she had helped to liberate. The marketplace of Rouen, scene of her martyrdom, became a destination for those who sought inspiration from her example or intercession through her prayers. Her influence on intellectual thought endured just as strongly. Philosophers and theologians continued to debate questions that her case had raised about the relationship between divine inspiration and human reason, between individual conviction and institutional authority, between the claims of conscience and the demands of obedience. Her example demonstrated that these tensions were not merely academic exercises, but practical challenges that could determine the fate of kingdoms and the salvation of souls. Those who analyzed her battles from a military perspective agreed that her brief time in command signaled a shift in the nature of warfare in Europe. The combination of technological innovation with psychological manipulation that characterized her methods pointed toward developments that would eventually transform medieval combat into something recognizably modern. Her understanding that morale mattered more than material advantage anticipated insights that professional soldiers would not fully appreciate for centuries. In worlds where status was inherited and women were confined by custom, the impact of her story continued to stir unrest and reflection. Her demonstration that divine calling could elevate peasants above princes and enable women to command armies challenged assumptions about natural hierarchy that had seemed as permanent as the movement of celestial bodies. The questions she had raised about the sources of legitimate authority would eventually contribute to political revolutions that transformed the entire structure of European civilization. She died as a heretic. She rose again in memory, a saint of battle, flame, and unbreakable faith.